My name is Dr. Jessie Lee McIsaac, and I'm a Canada Research Chair here at Mount St. Vincent University in Early Childhood. And I'm the Director of the Early Childhood Collaborative Research Centre. My centre is really excited to be bringing a seminar series throughout the fall and last spring as well, focusing on early childhood. So if you haven't followed us yet on social media, please do. We'll be posting and live tweeting also throughout the seminar today and using the hashtag Mobilizing Connections. Thanks. So today, I'm just going to be doing a bit of context setting to tell you a bit about why we're here today, what brought this seminar together, before I introduce our presenters. So we have a presentation from Dr. Isabel Smith and two storytellers here with us today, Kelly Arnold and Leanne Fletcher, who are going to be sharing their experiences working in early childhood and specifically with children with autism spectrum disorder. And after the presentation, the formal presentation, the storytelling, we're going to have a bit of question and answers for our speakers, and then we'll have a facilitate discussion where you have the opportunity to chat with each other about your experiences and what you've learned through the presentation. So what brought us here today? So I've been at the Mount for almost 2 years now, and my research center, the Early Childhood Collaborative Research Center, really has tried to find ways to connect people working in early childhood across the areas of research, policy, and practice. And we held an event about a year ago called Mobilizing Connections that brought together researchers, policymakers, and practitioners, and tried to find ways to intersect with one another and learn from one another. A really powerful part of that day was the use of storytelling and having people with real life experiences really leading the discussion and sharing that knowledge with us. So through our learnings from this event, we've put together the seminar series. This is our third of 4 seminars that are planned, funded by a exchange grant, a SHRC exchange, which is the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. Here, it's an internal grant here at Mount St. Vincent. So we're bringing this here to you today, and we're hopeful that we'll be able to continue these kinds of seminars in the future. So please do give us feedback on what your experience was like. So I think that's it for slides, right? Yep. But I'll introduce our speakers. So we're going to have our storytellers first. So Kelly Arnold is the inclusion coordinator at Point Pleasant Child Care Center. She has 10 years experience in the ECE field, and she's been in 2 years in this role as the inclusion coordinator. Leanne Fletcher is the assistant director at Point Pleasant Child Care Center, and she was previously the inclusion coordinator and has over 22 years of experience in the field. And Dr. Isabel Smith is a clinical developmental psychologist and the Joan and Jack Craig Chair in Autism Research at Dalhousie University and the IWK Health Center. Her research areas include early identification of autism spectrum disorder, long-term studies that follow the development of children with ASD and their families and treatment research. And Dr. Smith has been involved in evaluating the effectiveness of Nova Scotia's unique model of early behavioral intervention for preschoolers with ASD based on a pivotal response treatment since the program began in 2005. So please welcome me and please join me in welcoming our first storytellers, Kelly and Leanne.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much for the introduction. Please let me know if this isn't loud enough. So we're just going to get into our story to begin with, I think. And does it interrupt anything if I put this here? Okay. So our story actually begins with a family who enrolled their son in our center. So at the time, they required full-time care, and their son was just under 2 years of age. So they enrolled, he entered. So after the first few days of observing him in the classroom, we observed some things that caused us some concern, some things with his behavior that caused us some concern. And so some of the things that we saw when this child started was just kind of I describe it as extreme stimming behavior. You know, we had a really hard time. He really wouldn't participate in the routine. He really wasn't communicating in any way with us. And, you know, he wouldn't eat, that kind of thing. Basically, what we were seeing when he first started was what I described as this stimming behavior. So he really was just kind of circling the room, circulating like kind of any place we were at, even whether it was outdoors or inside or anything like that. So, you know, like we had these concerns, and we brought these concerns to the family, who were very receptive to what we were letting them know about what we were observing each day, and really like kind of interested in what we're saying, and ended up really taking action on that. And as a result, this led to our conversations with the family, and what we were seeing led to them taking action, and it led to kind of like a provisional diagnosis, I guess you would say, of autism spectrum disorder, but you know, was helpful to us at the time. So in keeping this like really open conversation with the family, they were very receptive to what we were saying about what we were seeing with their son each day. That was super helpful. You know, at the time that he was enrolled and we were seeing these things in his behavior throughout the daily routine, we had already had some experience with children with special needs, and also children who had been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, which was helpful to us at the time. Not only in terms of kind of figuring out kind of what kind of angle we would take with this child, but also how we would collaborate and have discussions with the family as well. So that was super helpful to us at the time. We also at that time had some experience with the early intensive behavioral intervention program. So that was great. So he was enrolled full time. Because we from the beginning had a really good relationship with the family understood where we were coming from, the family kind of had the same visions for their child as we did. The back and forth conversation with them was really helpful. So we were able to develop some little goals at the beginning, I guess. You can say. So, but even though we had some initial experience with children with autism, some initial experience with the EIBI program, we still kind of felt like we weren't just doing everything we could for this child. But through our experience previously, you know, we were able to kind of just get a little bit of a direction. We determined kind of some of what his motivations were, and we had a little bit of a direction based on our experience, based on what the family wanted. So we were kind of just moving forward at that point, which is great. And then, so throughout that first year of his experience with us, you know, although we had like an exceptional teaching team, we had myself, we had some support staff at the time, we still weren't able to give like all of us to him. Like from what we saw of his behavior, we determined that he needed one-on-one support. There was no question about that at that time. But we just felt like we couldn't give it our all. So we were really thankful at that time for the family's input. And I guess, of course, our administration's support, which we'll probably get into later with Kelly. But that was happening. We're kind of feeling like we sort of had a direction, but we weren't really sure we were on point and going in the right direction. So eventually, throughout that first year of his enrollment with us, the family was assigned a developmental interventionist, which was great. We had a little more direction, a little more support. It gave us some kind of, we know kind of where we're going. And things were progressing. He was doing better. He was, we were seeing just a little bit more, a little less of the, that kind of stimming behavior. Maybe a little teeny bit of some functional communication, like we were able to have him actually sit down and maybe take a bite of bread at lunchtime, which was all progress from where he had started. But we still all, as a team, as a teaching team, and with the families, developmental interventionists, we were missing that intensive piece. We knew that for sure because we had experienced that with other families for sure. So eventually, the family's dream came true, and by the time that this child was transitioning, probably about a year later, was transitioning into the preschool room at our center. He was accepted into the EIBI program, and so it was, I know, the family's dream come true for us. Wonderful, because we had already established a relationship. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So we knew what we were getting. We knew that we were going to get the support. We knew we had that intensive piece, which was beautiful for us. So we were super happy. So at this time, he was kind of a year into our service. And what the EIBI did at the time, we always felt like we just didn't know if we were going in the right direction. We knew that we were taking the family's dreams and wants and desires for their child, in keeping those in mind. We knew what he needed in order to be successful in our environment. But we needed that kind of fine tuning, and that's what the EIBI program did for us and for the family, which was awesome. So once he started in the program, then we really felt like we were able to prioritize goals for him and the family, and like I said, fine-tune things. So we knew we were going in the right direction at that point, and it was wonderful. So we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but just keep in mind that at this point we had already established a really great relationship with the EIBI program, and knew that they understood us very well and who we were. So that's why, part of the reason why we were so excited by when this family got accepted into the program. So this year went by, the intensive hours went by, we learned so much, and so did the family. So by the time that first year, actually not even the first year, so into the first 6 months of the intensive hours with this child, he was making so much more progress than we could have ever imagined. And what was so great about it was that even though, this family had so many hours of service each week, we learned so much from them that we were able to continue that service after his hours each day ended. We were able to continue it, and the family was also able to continue it. So it's one of the the keys is that, everything that is all the strategies and things that are put in place for the children that are involved in this program is that everyone involved in the child's life and every environment that the child is in, that everyone understands and has a good idea of what strategies work for the particular child, is that as long as that's all consistent across the day for that child, that's what makes it successful. So that's what we end up doing. By the time we were getting close to the end of the intensive hours, or actually the end of the actual therapy hours, because after a first year, the children go into just kind of consultative hours. We had a very good idea of who this child was, how he best learns, and what we needed to do to support him, and so did his family. So by the time he was ready to transition to primary, before he left our center, we were very confident that we had the ability to support him. If you walked into the classroom at that point, we had supports in place that you wouldn't necessarily even know. We think about him from the beginning, and he actually had an individual one-on-one support when he first started at our center, and by the time that he was that first year of service was finished for him, you could walk in the classroom and there were supports in place, but you wouldn't necessarily even know if you didn't know anything about the program at all, which was the goal in the end for us, which is kind of the beautiful piece for us, especially when children are leaving as an inclusive childcare center. That's our goal. We want to make sure that our goal is for children to be able to just kind of go through the daily routine and participate independently, and that's kind of what happened with this child for sure. In the end, there were, he had supports, but they weren't adult supports, they were peer supports, and a variety of others for sure. So yeah, by the time that he was transitioning into primary, that all went well. There were a few kind of challenges at the beginning for the family, but the knowledge that the family gained through being part of the program and the support that they received during his early years, they were kind of able to work through those kinks. And so he ended up being very well supported through his first early years of elementary, and which was great. We've actually, as a center, maintained a very good relationship with his family, so that's kind of why I know this is what's happened with him. So then there was just one fine day that happened, and it was when he was ready to go into his last year of elementary school, and he actually, up to this point, had EPA support through his elementary years, and he actually, before his last year of elementary, verbalized to his family that he really didn't need any EPA support anymore, which was just such a beautiful day for his family, because they had imagined, maybe this day would come, maybe they would say to his teaching team at his school that, I don't think he really needs that support, what do you think? When all along, he actually knew. And he verbalized that to his family, and it was just such a beautiful thing. It was amazing thing for us to hear, and sometimes almost brings me to tears to think about, which is so nice. But you know, what is even more beautiful is that the family really believes that it was through the support that they had from us as ECAs in our inclusive early childhood environment, our collaboration with the team that was providing service for his family, that led him to this point. So, and they've even verbalized to me that, you know, if he hadn't have had that great support in his early years, that they feel like he possibly wouldn't even have come to this point in his educational career, which is like, he's still very young in his career, his educational career, which is really beautiful to us. But I think probably one of, so that's just a beautiful story that one of many that we share, but there are some really key factors that determined, that contributed to our success in collaboration with the family and with the EIBA program, that I think is really important for everyone here to learn about. So, and that's what Kelly's going to talk about as well.
It's to your spot.
Yeah. Hi. So over the past 10 years, I've been at Point Pleasant. I've had the privilege of working with several families who have gone through the EIBI program. And one thing that really stands out that's key to this success is the collaboration piece. So like Leanne was saying, it's really about the family, the EIBI team, the professionals, the educators, the directors working together. And for us, what's made this really successful is that our center and EIBI shares a core value system and a vision between us. So you see that come out in our family-centered approach, which means the family is really a key part in developing goals and plans for this child. We have a strong belief in a fully inclusive environment so that all children can benefit from the program in the same way. And kind of as we go with the team, we make modifications as necessary to our program and environment, and how we work with each individual child. The center educators also really benefit from the intensive piece with EIBI. They learn and gain valuable skills, and they learn how to implement the same strategies that EIBI uses with the children on a day-to-day basis, which is great because it means they're also able to implement these strategies outside of the intensive hours, which means more consistency for the child and greater gains in their skills that they're working on. Ultimately, like Leanne was saying, the goal is for all children to be as independent as possible. And this is another area where our center's values align with EIBI. So over the yearly intensive program, we really start to look at where we're able to step back that intensive one-on-one piece so that the children have opportunities to use these skills on their own in their day-to-day routine. Parent training is another big piece that I found over the years really contributes to the success of the individual child. So through the EIBI program, they're also able to get individualized training and sessions at home as well as other environments where families feel they need support. And again, this contributes to the consistency piece across the board. The child's getting the same message from every angle, which really contributes to the outcome. The intensity piece is also a big factor. So like Leanne was saying, we're able to provide bits and pieces. Our center uses a lot of the same PRT strategies that EIBI does. So they get the same message, but due to it being a classroom size of typically 24, 3 teachers, maybe an inclusion coordinator or support staff, you're unable to get that intense piece. So when EIBI comes in, they're really able to provide that one-on-one piece, which is what makes it more successful for the child and family in the end. And EIBI also provides opportunities for meetings and reflections.
So the team comes together every so often, once a month, or is needed by the family. We look at where the child's at, where the family would like them to be, and really focus on the goals and where we want that child to end up in their program. Overall, the past 10 years working with EIBA has been a great experience. You can really see the outcomes, and Leanne's story is a perfect example of how this early intensive intervention can lead to so much success later in life. Isabel? Okay.
Thank you so much. You've already heard the most important part, which is from your peers who are actually working with kids and families in the program. So I really feel that I'm sort of the superfluous piece because I'm a clinician and a researcher. I've been studying the IBI program in Nova Scotia since it started. So I'm really going to give you a little more sort of the background of that program and the context for that I think created the success that these guys have experienced, and I hope some of you have as well. And I'm going to show you the results of some of the research that we've done that I hope will sort of help you think about why it makes such a difference for these kids to be, and their families to be involved in a program like that. So I just want to really briefly talk about autism spectrum disorder, just to make sure we're on the same page, that it's defined by the differences that we see in how kids are developing socially and communicatively. So it's not just that they're delayed, because often those skills are delayed, but they're different. They're developing in a different way. And that's really important because it isn't just a matter of waiting to see and having the kids catch up. They require different kinds of strategies because the skills are coming along in a different way. And those differences, I think all of you are probably quite familiar with on the social and communication end, because that's one of the areas we know is most important. The second area, though, is this idea of there being sort of kind of rigid or kind of repetitive or kind of limited thinking and behavior. And that's reflected in things like the sort of stimming behavior that Leanne mentioned. But it's, again, it's a developmental difference. This is not behavior you see in typically developing kids, or you see it in really mild form. Kids who are really kind of preoccupied with one toy, but not to the exclusion of all other toys. Or kids who have a little bit of sort of, flippy, flappy kind of behavior when they're excited, but not to the degree that we see in some of the kids with autism spectrum disorder. But the other thing I just want to emphasize is that in addition to these patterns of differences socially and in terms of behavior and thinking, it's not just a simple matter of being mildly affected versus severely affected. And people tend to sort of take shortcuts and talk about some kids being mild or severe, but it's that these differences are overlaid on differences in language development, sometimes differences in cognitive development. And so it's a more complicated picture than just, one spectrum, mild to severe. Every dimension, the social and communication differences, the thinking and the behavior, the motor skills, the other skills, all of those can vary. So in any group of kids, you can see quite different pictures. They're tied together by some common elements, but they can be quite different. So that's why it's hard sometimes for people to look at this kid and this kid and think they both have autism spectrum disorder. How can that be? So I'm just saying that so that you don't think in terms of it's a simple distinction between some kids are mild and some kids are severe, because a child can be relatively mildly affected in the social communication domain, so may have good language, but not be good at having a conversation, but have really rigid behavior, a really hard time with change, and really anxious and preoccupied with very limited kinds of play. And then you can have another child who's the flip, who's got a little bit of sort of fussy behavior, but really does not interact with other kids and doesn't communicate really well at all. So we can see all combinations. So that's just a sort of cautionary tale that this is a very diverse group of kids, which I think you already know. So how does this diverse group of kids get supported in an early intervention program in Nova Scotia that's based on two things: pivotal response treatment and positive behavior support? Because that's a different program than other provinces have. So I just want to give you, again, a little bit of background of where this program comes from. In most places, EIBI refers to a program that's based on a model that was started back in the 70s by a guy named Lovaas. You may have heard of that. It's called the Lovaas model or UCLA model. And it's considered a comprehensive program. You target every area of development. You have goals in every area of development. You have programs that look at the child's motor skills, their social skills, their language skills, their cognitive skills. And it's, these are very intensive programs. They're usually 20 to 40 hours a week of direct instruction. They usually last for 2 or more years. And there is research suggesting that programs like that can make quite a difference for kids with autism spectrum disorder compared to whatever else is available in their communities. So that research literature is mostly based on these very intensive programs, real hardcore applied behavior analysis. That isn't what the Nova Scotia program is. But in most parts of Canada, the early intervention programs for kids with autism are some version of that. Mostly they're relatively intensive. They follow that same model. They're modernized, so they're not as hardcore as that original model. But they're usually more than 20 or more hours a week of intervention. They usually last for multiple years. But they vary tremendously one province to another. And I'm not sure that people really know that that's the case. In some provinces, those programs are run through Departments of Education, Early Childhood. Here, it's in the Department of Health. Other places, it's in Departments of Community Services. There are some provinces that have a Ministry of Children and Families. They run. So the way they're funded, the way whether or not families are given money and they go out and hire people, or whether the people in the programs are actually public employees, all of those things vary from one province to another to a degree you might be surprised to learn. Only 3 provinces that I'm aware of have actually published any research on the way early intervention works in their provinces, and those are Ontario, Quebec, and Nova Scotia. So most of what's going on in Canada is tremendously varied, and most of it has no evaluation on it or research to support it. So that makes Nova Scotia really pretty unique, because the program started in Nova Scotia actually by the first Craig chair in autism research, who was Dr. Susan Bryson, who was actually my mentor. She was asked by the Department of Health and Wellness in Nova Scotia to develop a program because parents were asking for it. So back in the early 2000s, when Nova Scotia did not have a single model for intervention for kids with autism, they asked her to develop one. She surveyed all that was going on in the field and determined that pivotal response treatment was the way to go. She designed with the people who developed PRT, who are Drs. Cagle and Cagle from UC Santa Barbara in California. And they developed the Nova Scotia EIBI model. And it was put in place in the department, funded by the Department of Health and Wellness. And in 2005, the first teams were trained, and that was the start of it all. So it was only a few sites then. It was expanded 2 years later throughout Nova Scotia. In 2011, the government promised all kids would get it before they started school, and I think all of you know what that produced. It meant kids were getting it later and later and later because the resources didn't match that. So currently, children are being put in a shortened program right before they go to school, which isn't at all what the program was designed to do. But I won't get off on that. But you can ask me questions about that later. But just as context, that's where it all came from. And pivotal response treatment, again, I think probably most of you know, but it is behavioral intervention. It's based on applied behavior analysis, but it's referred to as naturalistic because all of the intervention happens where the kids are. So kids are not, across from a desk from someone being drilled on flashcards or something. They're in their homes or in the centers that they would go to typically, and they're getting behavioral intervention, and their parents are getting coaching in that. And it's targeting pivotal areas. And that means targeting, in particular, social and communication skills, because what the data tell us, and you'll see some data, I'm going to minimize showing you data, but you will see some data, showing that when you target social and communication skills as the sort of crux of autism spectrum disorder, we see changes in everything else. And it, in particular, focuses on positive experiences between the parent and child. So positive affect. When we're talking researchers speak, we say positive affect instead of just smiling at people, having a good time. And the program is all about educating parents and childcare providers, providing coaching, and empowering the people in the child's world to make a difference. The positive behavior support part of the program, again, familiar to all of you, is that old ABCs of behavior. But in particular, in positive behavior support, you're looking at the changes that set kids up for success. You change the environment, you make expectations clear, and you teach behavior that will accomplish whatever the child's misbehavior might be intended to accomplish. So it's very much focused on helping set up an environment in which the child can succeed. So the first study that we did was really just looking at the outcomes for kids and families and what predicted the best outcomes. I'm just going to show you a little bit about outcomes. So this was the first study of the first 118 kids whose families signed up for the research part. And just to show you, these were a group of kids who were sort of evenly divided into children who had very low cognitive abilities at the start of the intervention. So I've said autism spectrum disorder can be seen at any level of cognitive ability, but more kids have cognitive limitations than not. So at the start of this study, about a third of the kids had an IQ in the very severely delayed range. About a third were moderately affected in terms of their cognition, and another third had IQs in the average range. And that's important just because I'm going to show you sort of the variability that we see in autism spectrum disorder. So these are kids who were entering back when kids actually got a year of the IBI. And on average, these kids were about 4, but they ranged from 2 all the way to 6. You won't see a 2-year-old in that program now. And they were kids who had sort of moderately severe autism symptoms. And I'm just going to show you, this is I promise I won't show you too much data, and this is about as scary a graph as I could possibly show you. But I'll walk you through it. So there are actually 3 different graphs here. On the far left is the graph for the children who started the program with IQs in the very low range. So the most limited kids in terms of their actual cognitive abilities. Then the middle group is those who are moderately affected. And this group on the far right are the children who started the program with IQs that were in the typical range. They all have autism, all these kids, but their IQs are different. And in each one of these figures, there are lines representing individual kids that show where they were at the start of the intervention and where they were after a year of intervention. So what you should look at is the fact that those lines tend to go up, which means those kids are gaining developmentally. And all 3 groups of kids are gaining. But what you can see, then the black line in each one of these figures is the average kid in that group. So if you think of each one of those lines as a kid, you can see that most kids are making really good gains, but there's a lot of variation. Some of those lines are much steeper than other lines. You can see that they're the steepest for the kids who start out with typical IQs. They're a little less steep for the kids who start out with IQs in the moderately affected range. And they're the least steep in the kids who start out with IQs in low range. And that picture just tells us what we all know, which is that, you know, what the child brings to the party does affect the gains that they can make. So some children start out at a disadvantage. But it also tells you that all kids can make gains. Some make much bigger gains than others. So mostly I just want to show you that to show how diverse this group of kids is. So you see these wonderful success stories, some kids who make enormous gains, some kids make smaller gains, but that's okay because they're all making gains and their families are all benefiting. This picture shows their language skills of the 3 groups of kids, and this is exactly the same kind of picture that shows their scores on an IQ measure. And some kids are making huge gains. When you see a really steep line, that means those are enormous gains. We're not making kids, the intervention doesn't make kids smarter. It makes them better able to show what they can do. because they're interacting with people differently, they're cooperating, they can communicate, and they can show their skills better. So those are fantastic gains. And the size of the gains we saw in our early studies, kids in the Nova Scotia program, were just as strong as kids coming from these other programs that are big published results based on 20 to 40 hours a week of intervention. So the kinds of gains that we see in a PRT-based program that's really only targeting social and communication skills are pretty much the same gains as people report for programs that are supposed to be comprehensive, far more intense, and all of that. So that's basically what that says. So big individual differences in response. And I've said kids now are entering the program much later, and they're in their program for much shorter periods of time, and we don't really know what those effects are going to look like. But I want to show you some other data we have, because the big thing that we really need, and Canada needs, everybody needs, is studies that compare early intervention programs, because we can deliver one thing in Nova Scotia and say, isn't this great? They're delivering something else in Ontario. Well, actually in Ontario, all bets are off in terms of what's happening in Ontario, but British Columbia, for example, can say, you know, our kids are doing really great with what we deliver as well, but nobody's comparing them. So we set out to do that. So we did a study that's funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, comparing the programs for preschoolers with autism in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. It's right next door, similar provinces in terms of the families and the kids, other than half of their kids speak French. You know, you would think that we should see quite similar sorts of things going on. Completely different programs. So, and again, I won't go through all the detail here, but their program is much more like the traditional EIBI programs. But starting from the diagnosis, things are different. Because in Nova Scotia, we have diagnostic standards, regional teams do the diagnostic assessments, they're pretty rigorous. So we know that the kids in Nova Scotia have autism. New Brunswick has cast a much wider net. They basically let any pediatrician, even family doctor say, yep, that's autism, without any specific training or following any specific guidelines. So that has effects. Their kids, though, get into their early intervention program within 4 months of diagnosis. Kids here currently, it depends how old they are. If they're older, they get in faster. If they're younger, they wait longer, which is scary. The intervention models, again, completely different. Theirs is more comprehensive EIBI. It's 20 hours a week from the time of diagnosis until kids go to school. So for some kids diagnosed at less than 2, they could be in their EIBI program 20 hours a week for three or more years. Completely different. But the role of parents is different too. So our kids' parents, as Leanne and Kelly mentioned, get coached in PRT. So the parents learn those strategies. And the idea of that is that that would happen right after diagnosis, which would, you know, empower parents to be effective in communicating with their kids and helping their kids learn to communicate with them. And then others in the child's life, in the child care center, whatever, would learn those skills. In New Brunswick, there is no parent coaching component. And in fact, in some of their places, their agencies, the intervention was delivered in specialized centers. So they weren't even in inclusive settings. They've changed their program. So there have been big changes in New Brunswick since we finished this study, which is also interesting. But again, they're very, very, very different programs. So we asked 3 questions. First of all, did the kids show, how similar were the kids at the start of intervention? How much did their skills change during treatment? And did the rate of change differ between the 2 provinces? So at the time we collected the data, which was 2013 to 17, our 9 teams in Nova Scotia, which we still have, were delivering the EIBI, and they had 6 agencies completely independently delivering intervention in New Brunswick. They now have 1, they've changed that. They now have one agency. We looked at adaptive behavior, which to people, that means like everyday living skills, sort of, you know, the stuff that kids do every day, not IQ, because we weren't able to assess kids individually. We looked at a measure of their autism symptoms, and we looked at a measure of their challenging behavior. And so we got that information from parents at the start of the EIBI and 12 months later. So what was really stunning for us was how different the kids were at the start of intervention. So that first question, how do they compare at the start of intervention? Completely different. The Nova Scotia kids were a year older on average. They had lower abilities, cognitive adaptive behavior abilities on average, and they had more severe ASD symptoms. We don't know why, but one big clue might be the different diagnostic processes. We're certain that the Nova Scotia kids all have a diagnosis of autism. Maybe not all the kids in New Brunswick do. So they made a policy decision to cast a wide net and include kids who may or may not actually meet criteria for autism. But also the long wait for EIBI. So the kids on average in Nova Scotia were waiting a year. They're not getting better typically during that year. They may be getting a little bit better if they've got good support, but we're not seeing those huge increases we see in the EIBI. We also don't know for absolute certain that in the research, people didn't put some families forward for research and others not. So that piece we won't ever know, but that's what research is like. So the really stunning thing is that despite these disadvantages, Nova Scotia kids were older, lower functioning in terms of their abilities, and more severe symptoms, all things that would typically be associated with a poor response to intervention. And the Nova Scotia program is about half as many hours in a year as the New Brunswick program. However, the rate of gains that we saw in the two groups of kids were the same. So that we thought was pretty stunning. That suggests that there's something about the Nova Scotia program that's particularly powerful. I think it has to do with naturalistic intervention that happens where the kids are and parent coaching. I think. What do I know? And the focus on pivotal behavior. I think like really putting your eggs in the social communication basket and getting kids communicating, getting them interacting with people is the key. Rather than teaching them letters and numbers, which, you know, a more comprehensive program will include that, you know, pre-academic skills. To me, that's a lot less important for a kid than, you know, being able to interact with their mothers and fathers. So this is just a picture of, and again, it's not a very good figure, and again, I promise not to show you much data, but that lower line, the blue line, shows from age 3 to age 5-ish, what you'd expect a child, a typically developing child, to gain in terms of development. So that's gaining 1 month for every month older you get. Is that blue line going across there? Sorry. Sorry, the typical line is the black line going up there. The one labeled typical, strangely. Duh. This is why nobody should ever give a talk at dinner time. So that's the typical rate. The blue line at the bottom is what you'd expect for kids who are as delayed as the average kid with autism spectrum disorder. And this is in terms of their communication development. So that's starting from age 3 and going to age 5. Then that little blip on the line is the acceleration you see while kids are in EIBI. So starting at, you know, an average of, you know, more than age 4, that's how much acceleration you get. So you bump up their development from that line that's expected based on how they were doing before they've gotten the EIBI, and you see a little bit of acceleration. Does that make sense? I know it's kind of a weird figure, but look what would happen if you started that same intervention when they were 3 and just took that same rate and pushed that back to when they were 3. You'd expect if they started the EIBI then, they'd get to there, which is a lot better. And that's assuming that the rate of the acceleration would be the same as you see when you start at 4. Whereas there's a lot of reason to believe from a developmental theory point of view that if you started when they were 3 or younger, you'd see even faster growth. So that's my data piece. We also looked at outcomes for parents. We actually looked at early intervention service providers, and we did an economic evaluation. I'm not going to talk about all of that because you guys would be nodding off and probably so would I. But importantly, we measured something called parent self-efficacy, which is a real fancy way of saying how good parents feel about the effect they're having on their own kids' development. So self-mastery, self-efficacy, how competent do parents feel as parents? And what was really interesting is that we got a significant difference between parents in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, and the Nova Scotia parents were the ones who were being coached. So that empowered them. So they were higher at the beginning because they just had the coaching, and they were higher at the end. Both groups of parents showed improvements, but this is one instance where Nova Scotia parents actually looked stronger than New Brunswick parents in terms of how they were feeling about the effect they had on their kids. We also asked parents about their satisfaction with the EIBI programs, which is kind of an interesting question to ask somebody because it's the only program they've been in, right? So, and as it turns out, all parents were satisfied. You know, when we gave them both the same questionnaire, they were really satisfied in general with the intervention programs their kids had had. They were really feeling quite good about it. But we had some differences. Both had really positive comments about the EIBI providers, about the teams, about, you know, the wonderful people who were working with their kids and how dedicated they were. They both had really positive comments about some aspects of each of the programs. And both groups of parents had really positive comments about the difference it had made for them and their kids and their families. But the differences were kind of cool. The differences were the location of service delivery was appropriate. Nova Scotia families rated that higher. It's not big differences, but these are statistically significant if that matters to you. So that was because they were getting intervention at home or in their kids' regular daycare or preschool or childcare center. The New Brunswick parents, that was true for some, but in some places they were going to a specialized center that was all kids with autism. The team coordinated well with other child-focused services. Higher rating from Nova Scotia parents because their EIBI is working with the childcare, exactly what these guys just told you about. The team supported my involvement, higher for Nova Scotia parents because they were getting coaching and boosters in PRT and New Brunswick parents weren't getting that. I learned helpful strategies, higher from Nova Scotia parents because that was actually part of the program. And the intervention team provided high quality treatment, was actually rated a little bit higher by Nova Scotia families. The service providers, I'm going to really quickly just show you a couple other things. So we actually gave a questionnaire to the EIBI teams in both provinces. And in both cases, about 65-ish% of those people were frontline providers. And the others were sort of supervisory, administrative professional types in these two. We had responses from 173 in New Brunswick and 100 in Nova Scotia. I've never had that kind of response rate. There were differences. The Nova Scotia folks had more experience in their current positions, even though their program hadn't lasted, like the program hadn't existed for nearly as long as New Brunswick's had. The Nova Scotia providers also had higher education levels and more ASD-specific training. So I think the story there is there's turnover in that other program. Overall job satisfaction, the Nova Scotia providers rated it significantly higher than New Brunswick. Interestingly, confidence in understanding their roles, the New Brunswick teams rated higher. Theirs is a much more hierarchical system, and it's a much more, how do I say this? It's a more, I don't want to use the word cookbook, but I just did. It's more manualized in that you know what you're going to work on that day. The goals are set by the intervention team, and the child does this program and that program. Whereas as you guys know, it's very individualized in Nova Scotia EIBI, and the interventionists themselves are making decisions on the fly because they're following the child's lead. They're using the child's interests to drive the intervention forward. So it's a much more complex sort of decision-making role for the interventionist. And I think therefore they don't have as clear a picture of where they sit in the hierarchy. Satisfaction with salary and benefits, there was a massive difference. And again, I have never seen as many comments on a question. I don't know, when you guys fill out questionnaires, do you write in comments? Most people don't. 93% of the New Brunswick people and 84% of the Nova Scotia people actually wrote in comments on the questionnaires. And the vast majority of the New Brunswick providers, 79% of them were very unhappy with their salary benefits. And so no wonder there was turnover. And that's one of the things that New Brunswick changed after we finished our study. They created one agency and raised the salaries of all the people working. So responsive, right? But again, some interesting differences. EI teams work well together. Half of the Nova Scotia people said yes, and only 20%, less than 20% in New Brunswick. And these are just examples of the comments they made. But yeah, again, I was really struck. I've never seen that much feedback from people. So I just want you to think about a couple of things before you break up and start discussing among yourselves. Just think about the diverse needs of these kids and their families. So we've talked about some very basic things like how old the kids are, what their sort of basic abilities are in language and cognition, how severe their autism symptoms are. But think about two of the family strength and challenges. Think of a lot of these immigrant families who don't speak neither French nor English, who our EIBA teams have very limited capacity in French, much less in other languages. And how do you do parent training if the family speaks Arabic? So just think about, those families, think about their distribution across Nova Scotia, whether in the city, in a rural area, whether they've got a wonderful place like your centers for their kids to be or not. And then think about the variation in early intervention programs that I talked about, like how different they are across Canada. Think about how different the outcomes are for kids, given the variation in the kids and the programs. The program goals differ, the intensity differs, the duration of them differs. Think about who might benefit most or least. And we have done some research on that I don't have time to talk about, but I can certainly answer questions. And then how do we best support everybody? How do we best support these kids, these families, and all of you in the context of a program that's designed to try and accelerate the development of a really vulnerable group of kids who don't naturally learn as easily as other kids. So I think that should be some food for thought. And I guess, Sarah, you're going to talk to us about the next steps in the process. Are we taking questions first?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. Yes, she takes.
Are there any questions? Yes.
So from an educator's point of view here, if we have a child that we have concerns with, I know back in the day we used to be able to contact and say, we have a child we have concerns with. That has changed now. Who do we refer to?
How is it changed now?
Can we call your team and say we have a
So
child?
I'm on the research team. So the IWK has, it has a referral process for kids for whom someone has concerns about autism. Any healthcare professional can make a referral. They usually like to have a professional referral rather than family only, but even if the family self-refers, the team will often, just make sure they get contact information for a professional who can sort of back up the referral. So
but I've also heard that they have to be delayed, and they like to see, not so much that they like to see it delayed in two areas, but
I think you're talking about a different team. I think you're talking about the preschool special needs service. The autism team has never had a requirement like that.
Okay, so it's just
it's a suspicion of autism.
And may I say something?
Yeah, sure, certainly.
So from my understanding there, it is not for us as ECs to determine whether there's two areas that the child might not meet.
But again, there's no requirement for that in autism.
Yeah, no,
But,
So then you can make a referral to like early intervention or speech language or Nova Scotia hearing and speech. that kind of thing, who would then be able to make that determination? My understanding is we as EZs don't need to determine whether there's two variables.
Yeah, but again, that's completely independent of a referral about autism.
Right.
If you have a suspicion of autism spectrum disorder, then I think the ideal thing is for the family to have that conversation with the family, for the family to have a conversation with the family doctor. There are so many families who don't have a family doctor that's an issue. That's a big issue. I would always make a referral to Nova Scotia Hearing and Speech Centers if I was concerned about possible autism spectrum disorder, because social communication is a core part of that. And they can certainly make the referral to us if they share that concern. And when I say us, I mean the IWK, not me, because I'm in research, but to the IWK autism team. But there is no requirement that they show delays, because delay is not part of the definition of autism spectrum disorder. It's atypicality. So if you're concerned about autism, I would have the conversation with the family. If they have a family doctor, suggest that they take that route, and always refer to Nova Scotia Hearing and Speech Centers.
Isabel, I'm just going to give the opportunity to our satellite location, King's Tech. I don't know that their microphone's working very well, but we have asked them in the chat if they have any questions on their end. So, Lisa, if you can hear us, we're wondering if anybody on your end has any questions at King's Tech.
Continue answering.
Can we take a question while we,
Yes,
I don't
we
know,
can.
I didn't see who was
Right over
first,
here,
so.
I think. Yeah.
Okay.
Do you have any, like your team have any goals on making early intervention accessible to children? Because there's a bit of a hopeless sensation when you're experiencing an 18-month-old or a 2-year-old who's having, some severe struggles.
For sure.
Especially it's such a vulnerable age.
Yeah.
They're just starting.
Absolutely. And the program was designed to begin with.
Yeah,
So,
is there a goal on your end to sort of make things, because I know you said that the research backs it up regardless, like it's still, you're seeing improvements regardless of what the intervention's doing. But what I would like
but we believe they're better the earlier they start.
yeah,
So
is that something that you guys work with?
absolutely, but keep in mind that the decision-making is in the political arena, not ours. So there is no clinician, I think, on this planet who doesn't want to see that happen. There has been work done this summer toward making that happen. So if you know any politicians,
Send a letter to your MLA.
yeah, I mean, there's no question that needs to happen.
Okay.
And that is what this program is designed to do, and it's heartbreaking that we're seeing kids enter the program at 4.5, having waited for 2.5 years.
Yeah, we're basically being.
But you don't know. See, the problem with that is, if there is a demand, then that allows people to say, well, if there aren't younger children being referred, why should we worry about this? So you should always be making referrals, and you should be telling families to be vocal.
Yeah, the pushback's on your
But families are under a lot of stress, and it's a lot to ask of families who are struggling to then also become politically active. So if you guys can be advocates for the families you work with, that would be great.
You're good.
Okay. Is there another? Is it the same question? But yes.
How about after they have finished and moving on to primary? I know that program usually at that point.
Yes.
Is there going to be a bridge? Is there going to be some more? Because I find with all that intensive behavior support that you have for that solid year, working with them, and then all of a sudden you hear stories that
The family feels like they've dropped off a cliff.
Yes, and they're totally meeting a whole bunch of new people who don't know any background for this child.
So again, if EIBI was working as it was designed to, there would be more support from EIBI in the handover to schools. So they do meet with schools, and they do have a period during which they will provide some consultation to schools. But currently they're so backed up with these older kids just getting into the program that it's very hard for them to do that. But as the program was designed, there was supposed to be some carryover into schools. And I know that particularly in the HRCE, there's been real growth in the autism team there. They've added early transition coordinators. So there used to be 1 on the autism team in HRCE, and there's now 4. So each family of schools has a transition coordinator. So the new resources that have gone into schools, I think, are going to help a lot in terms of easing that. And then if the EIBI backlog could be addressed so that, they weren't just backed up to the limit seeing 4.5-year-olds, then there would be more possibility of easing that transition. And they'd have been starting to work earlier with the kids, so that, the children and their families would be in better shape to be starting school. Because it is a very abrupt transition now, because they're getting half the length of the IBI that it was designed to be, and then they're being catapulted into school.
Your heart goes because you're like,
Yeah.
I wish I could just be with you now.
I'm sure.
Right?
I'm sure a lot of you feel that way. Yeah, you get attached to these things.
I'm just
Oh, sorry.
I think this is you were
Go ahead,
earlier.
go ahead. Are there any cases that there is statistics or that we know about or your department knows about that kids get missed in early years and then they're about to start school?
Oh,
And they
absolutely.
get really
Yeah.
totally missed. Or
Yes.
even
Oh, yeah.
get diagnosed just
Yeah.
before
Yeah.
entering schools.
Oh, yeah, for
So
sure.
what happens?
So there are a couple of things that can happen. So a child can legitimately get missed because, their parents aren't aware of their differences. If a child isn't in a childcare setting where there are people who have, know what the appropriate expectations are for a child that age, there are certainly children that get missed. The other piece is that there are children, particularly those who have good language. Many of the kids who have those good pre-academic skills, so you all know those kids who can read when they're 2. So some parents can get sort of, over optimistic about what that means in terms of a child's development. So a child has good language, they know all their letters and numbers, and they may be, quirky, and parents don't really understand that that's more than quirky. Some of those children legitimately aren't picked up until they go to school and somebody sees them with their peers and unable to socialize appropriately with their peers. So those are two quite different things. So in terms of kids getting missed, one approach that we need to think about is better surveillance and screening in the healthcare system and the early education system, so those kids don't get missed. I think there will always be kids who get diagnosed later, because I think that just the range of kids with ASD is so large. I mean, some of these kids are brilliant, sort of intellectually, academically, but socially can be quite impaired, and it's hard to pick that up if they're not interacting with their peers. So 2 different issues.
It's confusing to me because I know we've had a young primary, or thank you. We had a young boy that was in our primary class, and this is why the IUBI, why does it not follow them to school? Because we had a young boy in grade primary that was diagnosed, who had to then leave our primary to go back to a daycare setting to get the IUBI he needed to make him more successful to then re-enter. So how confusing is that for that child and that family?
It's very confusing.
We
And
also
again,
had a child that went back and did pre-primary for a second time. I don't know if it's the same child or if it's just a coincidence, but went back and had to leave pre-primary, was at our daycare for a summer with the IBN, and then had to appeal the school system to get back into pre-primary because he was ready to start.
So this is all a result of people making rules to try and deal with the fact that the whole system is so unbelievably backed up. So I agree, that's very confusing. It genuinely was not designed to be delivered in a classroom. It was designed as a program, a preschool program. And if it was all working normally, that wouldn't be a problem. So I agree, it's heartbreaking for families whose kids, are of school age and they haven't gotten it. And there isn't a good response to that. But that's not how this program is designed to work. So again, advocate for your family.
I think we can take one more question. Here.
So I know when I moved here, sorry. When I moved here permanently I'm from the States originally, and that was back in 2008.
there were no BCBAs here at the time. And now I
Well,
know
there were a couple, but
there were a couple, but they're up and coming, which is great. And there's, like you said, through your research, so many people who are highly specialized to work with this population. Do you, with the backlog that the health system has, do you foresee like a sector breaking off of like private, and will that disqualify families if they in the interim get private services? Because sometimes we have certain situations where I want to advocate or make families aware. Let me help you find someone for the time being that works privately. And will that disqualify them from the EIBI program?
well, why don't you?
As for the private sector, it is quite large, and I find it's growing from a personal
And
standpoint
it's growing because
Because
of the
because of the
backlog.
backlog. So when we're looking at having children assessed, I very often say that these are your public options. However, just so you're aware, the wait list to be assessed is where I think if they have any.
Well, it's not, because it depends on
It's
how old you are.
age too, that's right. So, and that's a challenge. So I always inform them that there's private routes you can go through psychologists to be assessed and diagnosed as well. And then along with that, there's also a growing sector for private ABA therapy. So we've had a lot of children come into our center who are diagnosed privately because they don't want to wait. And then they start the private ABA or PRT therapy. And then once they're eligible, they're handed over to EIBI. And we have had private and the EIBI teams kind of work together in unison when possible. But that's also a challenge as well. So it's definitely growing.
Yeah, so there is nothing that would disqualify a family from accessing public services if they've had private services, for sure. And what used to be the case with private diagnostic assessments, when EIBI was actually a wait list rather than this very bizarre oldest first thing. If a family had a private diagnosis, they sort of entered the wait as though they were going to be diagnosed publicly, just because from a policy point of view, giving families an advantage because they can afford something is not particularly defensible, right? So, but families who can afford it, there are private services out there. But again, none of us believe that access to these services should be based on parents' resources. It's heartbreaking. So
we're just going to say thank you to our satellite site King's Tech for joining us. If you want, you can log off now as we're going to do our discussion period, and I believe you are as well. So thanks again for joining us, and please send me an email if you need anything.